James Carter sat on a cold park bench, rubbing his hands together to stay warm. His clothes were old, his shoes had holes, and his stomach growled from hunger. It had been a long time since he had a real meal, and even longer since he had a place to call home. Years ago, James had a good life. He worked as a mechanic, fixing cars and earning enough to get by. But when the company he worked for shut down, things went downhill fast. He lost his job, and soon after, he lost his apartment. With no family to help him, he ended up on the streets. Now, every day was a struggle. He searched for food in trash bins behind restaurants, hoping to find something still good enough to eat. Sometimes, kind strangers would give him a few coins, and he would use them to buy cheap coffee or a piece of bread. But most days, he was invisible, just another homeless man that people walked past without a second glance. One evening, as James walked near a bus stop, he noticed something on the ground. It was a black leather wallet. He picked it up and looked around, but no one was nearby. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, there were several credit cards, a few business cards, and a thick stack of $100 bills. His heart pounded. He had never held this much money in his life. For a moment, temptation crept in. With this money, he could buy warm clothes, a hotel room for a few nights, and good food. It could change his life, even if only for a little while. But as he looked at the ID inside, something made him pause. The name on the card read Robert Langford. There was also a photo of a well-dressed man with silver hair and sharp eyes. James sighed and sat down on the bench, staring at the wallet. He had every reason to keep it. After all, the man who lost it was probably rich. Would he even miss the money? But deep inside, James knew the answer. This wasn't about the money. It was about doing the right thing. Clutching the wallet tightly, he made up his mind. He had to find a way to return it. The next morning, James woke up early. He hadn't slept much, thinking about what to do. He had no phone, no internet, and no easy way to contact Mr. Langford. Then he remembered the business cards inside the wallet. Pulling one out, he read the address. Langford Enterprises, 45th floor, Hamilton Tower. He had never stepped foot inside a skyscraper before, but today he would. With his last dollar, James bought a small cup of coffee at a nearby shop and washed his face in the restroom. He didn't want to look completely hopeless when he walked into that office. Then, taking a deep breath, he started his long walk toward Hamilton Tower, unaware that this one honest act would change his life forever. James Carter stood outside Hamilton Tower, looking up at the massive glass building. It was taller than anything he had ever been inside. People in suits walked past him, talking on their phones, carrying briefcases, and rushing through the shiny glass doors. He hesitated for a moment, feeling out of place in his worn-out clothes and old sneakers. Would they even let him inside? Taking a deep breath, James clutched the black wallet in his hands and stepped forward. As soon as he entered, the warmth of the building surrounded him. The floor was made of polished marble, and the air smelled like expensive perfume and fresh coffee. He walked up to the front desk, where a young woman with neatly tied hair sat typing on a computer. She barely glanced at him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. James cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. I need to return this wallet. It belongs to Mr. Robert Langford." At the sound of the name, the receptionist finally looked up. Her eyes went from James's face to his old jacket, then down to the wallet in his hands. For a moment, she seemed unsure of what to say. "Mr. Langford," she repeated. "Yes," James said. "I found this near the bus stop last night. I just want to make sure it gets back to him." The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone and spoke quietly into it. A few moments later, a large security guard approached. "Come with me," he said. James followed him through the sleek hallways, feeling every pair of eyes on him. He wondered if they thought he was a thief. His heart pounded as they stepped into an elevator that moved so smoothly. He barely felt it going up. When the doors opened, James found himself in a large office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Behind a dark wooden desk sat Robert Langford, the man from the ID. He was even more intimidating in person, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, his silver hair neatly combed. Mr. Langford looked up from his laptop, his piercing blue eyes locking onto James. The room was silent for a moment. Then James stepped forward and placed the wallet on the desk. "I found this yesterday. It's yours." Langford picked up the wallet and opened it. His expression didn't change as he checked the contents. Then, finally, he looked back at James. "You didn't take anything?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. James shook his head. "No, sir." Langford leaned back in his chair. "Do you know how much money is in here?" "Enough to change my week," James admitted. "Maybe even my month. But it's not mine." For the first time, Langford's serious face softened. He reached into the wallet, pulled out a few $100 bills, and held them out. "Take this," he said. James hesitated. He could use that money. He could eat a hot meal tonight, maybe even sleep in a real bed. But something inside him wouldn't let him take it. He shook his head. "I didn't do this for a reward." Langford studied him for a long moment. Then, to James's surprise, a small smile appeared on his face. "I see," he said. "In that case, I have a different offer for you." James frowned. "An offer?" Langford pressed a button on his desk phone. "My driver will take you somewhere tomorrow morning," he said. "Be ready." James had no idea what was happening, but as he left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to change. James Carter couldn't sleep that night. He lay on his usual park bench, staring up at the dark sky. His mind kept replaying the conversation with Robert Langford. "My driver will take you somewhere tomorrow. Be ready." What did that mean? Where was he going? James had no idea, but he knew one thing. This was the first time in years that someone had looked at him like he was worth something. Not with pity, not with disgust, but with interest. By morning, James was already awake, waiting near the entrance of the park. He had no bags, no extra clothes, nothing to take with him. He had spent years carrying everything he owned in his pockets. At exactly 9 a.m., a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The windows were dark, and the body shined like it had just been washed. A tall man in a suit stepped out and opened the back door. "Mr. Carter." James nodded. "Please, get in." James hesitated. He had never ridden in a car like this before. He didn't belong in fancy places or expensive vehicles, but something inside him pushed him forward. He slid into the back seat, the leather softer than anything he had ever sat on. The car pulled away from the curb, moving smoothly through the city streets. James looked out the window as they passed restaurants, stores, and office buildings. He had walked these streets for years, but from inside this car, they looked different, brighter, bigger, full of possibilities. After about 20 minutes, the car turned into a gated property. The gates opened slowly, revealing a massive glass building surrounded by green gardens and fountains. The driver parked near the entrance and stepped out. James swallowed hard. This place looked even fancier than Hamilton Tower. The driver opened the door. "Go inside. Mr. Langford is waiting for you." James stepped out and walked through the large glass doors. The air smelled fresh, like coffee and clean paper. People in business clothes moved around, talking and working. No one gave him strange looks. No one told him he didn't belong. A woman with a kind smile approached him. "You must be Mr. Carter. Follow me, please." James followed her through the wide hallway, feeling nervous. Finally, she stopped in front of a large wooden door and knocked once before pushing it open. Inside, Robert Langford sat at a large table, sipping a cup of coffee. He gestured for James to sit across from him. James sat down, his hands resting on his lap. "I don't understand why I'm here," he said honestly. Langford smiled. I like people who do the right thing, even when no one is watching, he said. It's rare. James didn't know what to say. He wasn't special. He was just a man trying to survive. Langford leaned forward. Tell me, James, if you had a second chance, what would you do with it? James hesitated. No one had asked him that before. Not since he lost everything. He swallowed. I'd work, he said. Earn my own way. I don't want a handout. Langford nodded, as if he had expected that answer. He reached into a folder and pulled out a piece of paper. He slid it across the table. This is a job offer, Langford said. Come work for me. James blinked. What? You heard me, Langford said, smiling. Show up tomorrow morning. We'll get you cleaned up, and then we'll see what you can do. James stared at the paper, his heart pounding. This was real. This was happening. For the first time in years, he had hope. James Carter walked out of the office building in a daze, gripping the job offer paper tightly in his hands. His heart pounded as he reread the words. A job. A real job. For years, he had dreamed of a second chance, but life had only given him cold nights and empty pockets. Now, in less than 24 hours, everything had changed. But doubt crept into his mind. Why would a rich man like Robert Langford hire someone like me? What if this is some kind of mistake? James shook his head. He couldn't let fear stop him. He had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The next morning, James arrived at the building as the sun rose. He had spent the night at a shelter, using the bathroom sink to wash up as best as he could. His clothes were still old, but at least they were clean. When he entered the lobby, a man in a suit greeted him. Mr. Carter, right this way. James followed him to an elevator that took them to a different floor than yesterday. When the doors opened, they stepped into a bright, modern space filled with glass windows and sleek furniture. A woman with a warm smile approached. Good morning, Mr. Carter. My name is Susan. Mr. Langford has arranged for you to get cleaned up before you start work. James raised an eyebrow. Cleaned up. She pointed toward a side door. There's a fresh set of clothes waiting for you inside. Take your time. James hesitated but nodded. He stepped into the room and froze. Inside, a full set of brand new clothes was laid out on a chair. Dress pants, a crisp shirt, polished shoes. A clean towel and soap sat beside a large mirror. James swallowed hard. It had been years since he had worn anything other than thrift store hand-me-downs. Slowly, he walked to the sink and turned on the warm water. He washed his face, running his fingers over the rough stubble on his chin. Then he put on the fresh clothes. When he looked in the mirror, he almost didn't recognize himself. For the first time in years, he looked like a man with a future. When James stepped out, Susan smiled. Much better. Follow me. She led him through the office, where employees sat at desks, typing on computers or talking on the phone. No one looked at him strangely. No one whispered. He was just another worker now. Finally, they'd reached a small but comfortable office. Inside, Robert Langford was waiting. Take a seat, James, Langford said, gesturing to a chair. James sat down, still feeling unsure. Sir, I don't understand. Why are you helping me? Langford leaned forward. Because I believe in second chances, and because honesty is worth more than gold. James swallowed. But I don't have any experience. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. Langford smiled. You'll start as an assistant. Answer calls, organize paperwork, learn how this company works. If you prove yourself, we'll talk about moving up. James took a deep breath. This was real. He had a chance, a real chance, to rebuild his life. Are you ready? Langford asked. James nodded firmly. Yes, sir. I won't let you down. Langford smiled. Then let's get started. James Carter sat at his new desk, staring at the computer screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. It had been years since he had used a computer, and he wasn't sure if he even remembered how. Susan, The friendly woman who had helped him earlier stood beside him. "Don't worry," she said with a smile. "I'll show you everything you need to know." James nodded, trying to stay calm. He didn't want to mess up. He didn't want to disappoint Mr. Langford. "First, let's start with emails," Susan said. She clicked on a few buttons, explaining how to check messages, reply, and organize them. "It's simple once you get used to it." James watched carefully. His hands were rough from years of living on the streets, but he slowly placed them on the keyboard. He typed his first email, a short message to confirm an appointment for Mr. Langford. His fingers felt stiff, but he managed. "Good," Susan said. "Now, let's go over scheduling meetings." For the next few hours, James focused hard. He took notes, asked questions, and practiced until he felt more comfortable. Every time he completed a task, a small sense of pride grew inside him. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was working. By lunchtime, James had already answered emails, scheduled a meeting, and organized some documents. "You're picking this up fast," Susan said as she handed him a file. "Now take this to Mr. Langford's office." James took the file carefully and walked toward the large wooden doors. He knocked, and Mr. Langford's voice called from inside. "Come in." James stepped inside and placed the file on the desk. Langford glanced at it and nodded. "How's your first day going?" he asked. James hesitated. "It's a lot to learn," he admitted, "but I'm trying my best." Langford smiled. "That's all I ask. Keep going, and you'll do just fine." James felt a wave of relief. He had been worried that Langford would expect him to be perfect from the start. But no, he was being given time to learn. "Thank you, sir," James said. Langford nodded. "Now go have some lunch. You've earned it." James walked to the break room, where other employees were eating and chatting. He hesitated at the door. He wasn't used to being part of a group. But then a young man waved at him. "Hey, you're the new guy, right? Come sit with us." James smiled and sat down. The group introduced themselves, talking about their work and their lives. They treated him like any other coworker. For the first time in years, James felt normal. As he ate his sandwich, one of the best meals he had in a long time, he realized something. He wasn't just lucky to be here. He deserved to be here, and he wasn't going to waste this chance. James Carter woke up earlier than usual the next morning. His nerves were still there, but so was his excitement. He had a real job now, and he wasn't going to let anything ruin it. After getting ready as best as he could, he arrived at the office just as the sun was rising. The security guard at the entrance gave him a nod. "You're early," the man said with a small smile. "Just want to get a head start," James replied. When he reached his desk, he took a deep breath and turned on the computer. He checked emails, organized schedules, and reviewed the tasks Susan had assigned him the day before. He was determined to be the best employee he could be. A few hours later, Susan approached him with a concerned look. "James, Mr. Langford has an important meeting later, but there's a mix-up with the paperwork. The documents aren't where they should be." James immediately stood up. "I'll find them," he said. Susan handed him a list. "They should be somewhere in the storage room, but it's a mess in there." James nodded and hurried toward the room. When he opened the door, he saw rows of old filing cabinets and stacks of papers everywhere. It was overwhelming, but he didn't hesitate. One by one, he searched through the cabinets, scanning each label carefully. The minutes passed quickly, but he refused to give up. Finally, near the back of the room, he spotted a dusty folder with the right label. He grabbed it and flipped through the pages. Everything was there. Without wasting a second, he rushed back to the office and placed the file on Susan's desk. "Found it," he said, slightly out of breath. Susan's eyes widened. That was fast. James wiped his forehead and smiled. Didn't want to waste any time. Susan shook her head in amazement. "Mr. Langford is going to be impressed." Later that day, James was focused on typing an email when he heard a voice behind him. "James, can I see you for a moment?" He turned around and saw Mr. Langford standing by his office door. James swallowed his nerves and followed him inside. Langford sat down and placed the recovered file on his desk. "Susan told me you found these in record time." James nodded. "Just wanted to help, sir." Langford leaned back in his chair. "You've only been here a short time, but you're already proving yourself." James felt a sense of pride. "I'll do whatever it takes to be useful, sir." Langford studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's exactly the kind of attitude we need here. Keep up the good work, James." James left the office with his heart pounding. He had done something right. For the first time in a long time, he felt valued. And he wasn't going to stop now. James arrived at work earlier than usual the next morning. He had barely slept, but not because of stress. He was excited. Every day at the office felt like a step towards something bigger. He was learning, improving, and proving to himself that he was more than just his past. As he settled at his desk, Susan approached him with a small smile. "Busy morning ahead," she said, placing a folder on his desk. James opened it and scanned the schedule. Meetings, emails, organizing documents. It was a full day, but he was ready. Then Susan hesitated. "Also, Mr. Langford wants you to assist in today's client meeting." James looked up, surprised. "Me?" Susan nodded. "He said he wants you to observe and take notes." James felt a wave of nervousness. He had never sat in a meeting with important clients before. What if he made a mistake? But then he remembered something. Mr. Langford wouldn't have asked him if he didn't believe in him. James straightened his back. "Okay, I'll be ready." An hour later, James followed Mr. Langford into the large conference room. Several men and women in business suits sat around the long table. They looked important. Langford introduced James to everyone. "This is James Carter. He's assisting me today." James nodded politely. He felt out of place, but he focused on his task. As the meeting began, he listened carefully, jotting down notes as Langford spoke. The discussion was about a big business deal, and though some of the terms were new to him, James paid close attention. At one point, a client asked a question about scheduling. Langford turned to James. "Can you check the calendar for that?" James quickly navigated the system on his laptop and found the answer. "Yes, sir. That date is open for the meeting." Langford nodded, satisfied. "Good work." James let out a small breath of relief. After the meeting, Langford pulled him aside. "How did that feel?" James smiled. "A little overwhelming, but I liked it." Langford chuckled. "Good, because I want you to start preparing reports for these meetings. You have potential, James. Don't let doubt hold you back." James felt a surge of motivation. "I won't, sir." As he returned to his desk, he realized something. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a new beginning. James sat at his desk, staring at the blank document on his screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he took a deep breath. This was it, his first real report from Mr. Langford. He had attended the meeting, taken notes, and now it was his job to put everything together in a professional format. He started typing, carefully choosing his words. He wanted the report to be clear, detailed, and well organized. An hour passed, then two. He checked every line, making sure everything was perfect. When he was finally done, he printed a copy and walked over to Susan's desk. "Could you check this before I give it to Mr. Langford?" he asked. Susan took the papers and scanned through them. Her eyebrows raised slightly. "James, this is really well done." James felt a rush of relief. "You think so?" Susan smiled. "I know so. Go give it to him." James knocked on Mr. Langford's office door and stepped inside. "Sir, here's the report from today's meeting," he said, placing the papers on the desk. Langford picked it up and started reading. James stood still, his hands clasped behind his back. His heart pounded with every second that passed. Finally, Langford put the papers down and looked at him. "This is excellent, James." James exhaled, smiling. "Thank you, sir." Langford leaned back in his chair. "I've been watching your progress, and I'm impressed. You've worked hard, learned quickly, and shown real dedication." James nodded, waiting. Langford continued, "I think it's time we make this official." He reached into his desk and pulled out a small envelope. "This is your full-time employment contract." James blinked in shock. "Full-time?" Langford nodded. "You've earned it. No more probation period. You're part of the team now." James took the envelope with slightly shaking hands. Just a few days ago, he had been sleeping in the cold, wondering if life would ever change. And now he had a real job, a future, and people who believed in him. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Langford gave him a rare smile. "Don't thank me. You made this happen." That evening, as James left the office, he looked up at the city skyline. He wasn't just a man struggling to survive anymore. He had taken a chance, worked hard, and proved his worth. And this was only the beginning. James walked down the street, not as a homeless man, but as someone with a future, a man with hope. He had been given a chance, and he would never waste it.